Hello, everyone. You might be aware of a direct communication line established between Washington and Moscow, facilitating phone exchanges between the U.S. President and the President of Russia. This line was installed following the Cuban Missile Crisis, a pivotal event during which the U.S. and the Soviet Union nearly plunged the world into nuclear conflict. The Doomsday Clock, introduced in 1947 by atomic scientists behind the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, serves as a warning about the risks to humanity. Its initial setting marked 7 minutes to midnight, indicating an impending nuclear conflict. The clock has historically moved based on global threats. It was once set to 17 minutes before midnight in 1991. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, when nuclear risks were significantly lower. However, in 2020, as tensions rose with North Korea's missile launches, it was adjusted to 2 minutes to midnight. Currently, if you check the website, the clock stands at 1 minute and 40 seconds to midnight, highlighting the urgency of the situation. Today, we will discuss the conflict known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, which unfolded in the fall of 1962. Before delving into that event, it's essential to understand the background that led to it. This crisis was influenced by earlier tensions arising from developments in Turkey. In 1945, the Allies, consisting of the Soviet Union, Great Britain, France, and the United States, emerged victorious over Nazi Germany. Together, these nations also collaborated in defeating Japan. Following these victories, the world could have returned to a state of normalcy. However, as both the Soviet Union and the United States solidified their positions as major powers, tensions began to escalate. This dynamic led to the establishment of NATO, the North Atlantic Alliance, on one side, and the creation of the Warsaw Pact, which encompassed nearly all of Eastern Europe, on the other. The Soviet Union's allies were part of a socialist bloc entirely under its control. This marked the beginning of the Cold War, characterized by a struggle for dominance and expanding geopolitical influence. A well-known historical reference points to Churchill's speech that highlighted communism as a global threat, setting the stage for ongoing tensions. The United States created the atomic bomb and used it on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, prompting Soviet scientists to develop their own nuclear capabilities. This development might suggest a fragile peace, given that both superpowers possessed nuclear weapons, rendering any potential Third World War unwinnable. However, this reality did not prevent the U.S. and the Soviet Union from entering into an arms race. In 1956, the Soviet Union adopted a new doctrine that emphasized a shift from conventional weapons to missile and nuclear confrontation, signaling the world's transition into a new era. While tanks, helicopters, and aircraft remained significant, it's clear that missile technology would dictate the outcomes of future conflicts. In 1957, a significant development took place when the Soviet Union successfully introduced the intercontinental missile. This advancement meant that a missile launched from Soviet soil could reach the United States, undermining America's sense of security that had been bolstered by its geographic separation. Historical attempts like Japan's plans to land on U.S. territory during World War II had failed, which reinforced this perception of safety. However, the emergence of intercontinental missiles changed the landscape, allowing for strikes on American land. These missiles were integrated into various military branches and increasingly deployed within air defense units, most notably enhancing the capabilities of the Soviet submarine fleet. Going forward, the Soviets prioritized developing nuclear-powered submarines capable of covert long-range missions to approach and target enemy assets. The year 1957 marks the beginning of the arms race. In 1959, a significant event unfolded as Fidel Castro seized power in Cuba by overthrowing dictator Batista. Castro's rise has major implications for the United States, making Cuba a critical focal point in the geopolitical landscape. Cuba can be likened to America's Monaco, not as an offshore zone, but as a destination for luxury and leisure. The island was a significant hub for American businesses, including banks, American Telephone and Telegraph, and numerous sugar companies. Most notably, it boasted numerous casinos, nearly all owned by the Italian mafia, making it a prime hotspot for American tourists and a lucrative marketplace. After Castro assumed power, it's important to note that he did not instantly embrace communism or align himself with the Soviet Union, which is a common misconception. Initially, he sought to establish a connection with the United States. Castro even traveled to America in hopes of meeting President Dwight Eisenhower, but Eisenhower did not make time for him, leaving Castro understandably insulted. Faced with this snub, Castro turned to Nikita Khrushchev and the Soviet Union for support, declaring, "I am fully committed to communism from my jacket to my shoes. However, the Americans intend to overthrow me and refuse to work with me." The refusal of Americans to cooperate with Castro prompted him to initiate a nationalization campaign, seizing all banks, casinos, and Western businesses, which he claimed as property of the Cuban people. In retaliation, the United States implemented an economic blockade, essentially imposing sanctions. Cuba's primary export was sugar, and the U.S. ceased purchasing it, which led to a halt in oil and petroleum supplies to Cuba. This action triggered a significant crisis for the island nation. At that point, Castro traveled to meet with Khrushchev, who quickly struck a deal with him, initiating a program I would describe as oil in exchange for everything. As a child in the Soviet Union, I recall enjoying delicious juices made in Cuba under the Taro brand, such as mango, banana, and pineapple. The USSR imported a variety of Cuban products, including tobacco and cigars, as well as resources like rare earth metals and other minerals found in Cuban soil. In exchange, the Soviets provided Cuba with extensive support, including oil deliveries and Soviet engineers to help build its infrastructure. Military personnel were also sent, along with significant financial aid, to bolster Cuba's economy. The USSR fully backed this regime, transforming Cuba into another ally and strategic outpost located just off the coast of the United States. While the USSR referred to it as the Island of Freedom, Americans humorously labeled it the Big Soviet Submarine, due to its proximity to Florida. On May 1st, 1960, as the Cold War intensified, a pivotal event occurred. An American spy plane was shot down over the Urals. This incident was notable because American aircraft frequently flew over Soviet airspace to capture aerial photographs and gather intelligence. While Soviet MiGs occasionally succeeded in intercepting these planes, this time we managed to shoot it down. In 1961, the Soviet Union broke the moratorium on atmospheric nuclear testing and conducted a series of tests, surprising the Americans and demonstrating our nuclear capabilities. That spring, the U.S. attempted to overthrow Castro's regime by landing troops in Cuba, but Castro successfully thwarted the invasion. The invading force was largely captured or repelled, with some members evacuated, leading to a failed coup. So, what truly marked the beginning of the Cuban Missile Crisis? Contrary to popular belief, it didn't originate in Cuba or even from the Soviet Union. It actually started in Izmir, Turkey, where in 1961, the Americans positioned ballistic missiles that placed Moscow and Western Soviet territories within striking range with a flight time of under 10 minutes. This enabled the U.S. to launch nuclear missiles from Turkish soil at our doorstep, provoking a fierce reaction from the Soviet Union. Khrushchev was both enraged and deeply concerned. At that time, the power balance was clearly skewed. The Soviet Union possessed 300 nuclear warheads compared to the United States' 6,000. Moreover, the U.S. had an additional 183 land-based missiles, 144 submarine-launched missiles, and 1,300 aircraft, giving them a substantial strategic advantage. Compound that with missiles stationed in Turkey, and it became evident how challenging it was for the Soviets to effectively counter such a disparity. In August 1961, Khrushchev executed what we could term an asymmetric response, though it was essentially symmetrical in nature. This was when the iconic Berlin Wall began to take shape, soon dividing the city. East Berlin remained on one side, while West Berlin became a leverage point for the Soviet Union. It signified that if the West engaged in provocative actions in Turkey or elsewhere in Czechoslovakia or Poland, the Soviet Union would retaliate through West Berlin. Until the late 1980s, when the Berlin Wall fell, West Berlin existed under the persistent shadow of war, creating a distinctive ambiance filled with both decadence and lively nightlife. This sense of danger attracted artists and performers, including notable figures like David Bowie, and contributed to a vibrant cultural scene that became significant in modern history, particularly in rock music and contemporary art. However, beneath the surface of this creativity lay a stark reality. Residents lived in constant fear, anxious that Soviet tanks and troops could breach the wall at any moment. What was unfolding around the globe beyond West Berlin? A continuous effort to redefine and expand spheres of influence was underway. The Soviet Union positioned itself as an ally to various free countries and emerging socialist regimes, gaining popularity in Africa and Latin America by supplying weapons and financial support. These nations, from Angola to Nicaragua, would promptly proclaim their commitment to communism in exchange for our backing. This illustrated the dynamics at play as we sought to extend our influence globally, with the Americans actively countering us, particularly in South Africa. Despite future condemnation of the apartheid regime by various European thinkers and politicians, the U.S. continued to support South Africa at that time. Western Europe represented America's key ally. As the U.S. argued, Russia is right next door. We are your only protection if they attack. Meanwhile, Turkey, a NATO member, hosted American missiles. Khrushchev objected to this deployment, labeling it a threat to Soviet national security. In response, the Americans and Turks were unequivocal. The Turkish officials asserted, "We are on our own territory and can station whatever we choose. This isn't an act of war. So if you have concerns, Comrade Khrushchev, that's your issue. The missiles will remain here." Khrushchev began to contemplate a response. On May 21, 1962, he convened a Defense Council meeting following a visit to socialist Bulgaria. During his trip, his Bulgarian counterparts, while at the shores of the Black Sea, pointed out the proximity of Izmir, stating, "Nikita Sergeyevich, missiles will be launched from that Turkish city." This revelation had a profound impact on Khrushchev, prompting him to call the Security Council and assert, "We need to take action." Despite prior threats to take action in West Berlin, the only significant event there was the construction of the wall. This situation sparked the conceptualization of Cuba as a beacon of freedom, or island of freedom. Consequently, the decision was made to install Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. The Defense Council nearly unanimously approved this plan, with one notable dissent from Anadyr Mikoyan, a prominent figure in his own right. There's a saying about him, "From Ilyich Lenin to Ilyich Brezhnev, without a heart attack or stroke." He truly excelled as a survivor in Soviet politics, beginning his career under Lenin and concluding it during Brezhnev's rule. Throughout his lengthy tenure, he adeptly navigated various political landscapes, engaging in trade and other affairs while continuously finding his way. He outlasted Stalin's purges, endured Khrushchev's ousting, and adapted throughout the Brezhnev era. One can't help but admire the skills required to maneuver skillfully among diverse political factions and emerge successfully. People often described him as someone capable of striking a deal with the devil, remarkably intelligent, a brilliant diplomat, and an exceptional pragmatist. A classic anecdote illustrates his character during a trade mission in the UK, where he secured a highly profitable deal for both sides. According to the story, some members of Parliament, or perhaps even the Queen, though this is questionable, presented Mikoyan with a Rolls-Royce as a gift. He responded, "As a Soviet communist, I cannot accept such an extravagant gift from you, dear friends. I can only purchase it, but it's quite an expensive car. How could I afford it?" They offered to sell it for just £2. The tale humorously concludes with Mikoyan pulling out his wallet and saying, "Actually, I have £4. I'll take 2. While the Rolls-Royce details may be exaggerated, this story perfectly encapsulates his personality. Mikoyan opposed the Cuban plan, but ultimately, the decision was made to proceed with Soviet involvement in Cuba. Negotiations with Fidel Castro transpired rapidly, and on May 30th, Castro consented, stating, "We will gladly accept your missiles because we fear a repeat American attack." Thus, the plan was established to send 24 medium-range missiles, 16 intermediate-range missiles, 1 helicopter regiment, a squadron of MiGs, 42 Il-28 bombers, 2 units of nuclear-armed missiles, along with 2 cruisers, 14 destroyers, and 12 Komar-class missile boats, names evocative of classic Soviet weaponry. Additionally, 11 submarines were included in the deployment. The intention was to bolster this presence permanently and expand it to 50,000 troops, forming a formidable contingent in Cuba. Comrade Pliyev was assigned as the commander of this force. Transporting all these weapons to Cuba necessitated a remarkable degree of secrecy. The operation, known by the classic Soviet code name Anadyr, was designed to mislead observers into thinking that the Soviet Union was primarily focused on U-2 reconnaissance flights over Chukotka and other northern territories, while urgently needing to mobilize a large military force there. As a result, ships began loading supplies across various Soviet ports, from the North to the Black Sea, filled with items like felt boots, sheepskin coats, and skis, essential for the far north. Within this load, the weapons, including nuclear missiles, were also covertly stashed. Each ship's captain received a sealed envelope, which they could only open 24 hours into the voyage and in the presence of a political officer. Consequently, these ships set sail from different ports simultaneously. After a day at sea, the captains opened their envelopes and discovered their true orders: proceed to the island of freedom, Cuba. This marked the beginning of Operation Anadyr. By August 1962, all convoys successfully arrived in Cuba, showcasing an impressive logistical feat. Though I'm not an expert in logistics or military operations, the successful organization and lack of leaks, making sure the Americans remained unaware, are commendable. By August 1962, 2 military bases had been constructed in Cuba for nuclear missile deployment, one in San Cristobal and another in Casilda. Within just 2 months, by October 14th, all necessary military units had been mobilized, squadrons were ready, and the missiles were standing by for potential combat duty. The USSR was therefore poised to strike U.S. territory if necessary, all while the Americans closely monitored developments in Cuba. In September 1962, a U-2 spy plane flew over Cuba and captured photos revealing soccer fields. These images made their way to the CIA, which quickly recognized the implications. Russians were in Cuba, since soccer was not a popular sport among Cubans, who primarily played baseball. The presence of soccer fields indicated that the Russians had arrived. The CIA subsequently informed U.S. President John F. Kennedy of their findings. Kennedy made an unconventional decision by suspending reconnaissance flights over Cuba due to concerns that anti-aircraft weapons could target the planes. However, this ban was short-lived as flights resumed on October 14th. In mid-October 1962, Major Richard Heiser piloted a plane from California, flew around Cuba, and landed in Florida. The photographs he captured were sent to the CIA, where analysts quickly and accurately concluded that Soviet nuclear weapons were indeed present in Cuba. How did the Americans come to this conclusion? I initially wondered how they recognized Soviet missiles. Were they taking daily photographs? The answer lies in an important informant they had within the KGB named Penkovsky. He supplied the Americans with critical information about weapon types, deployment locations, and photos. Thanks to Penkovsky's intelligence work, the U.S. was able to easily identify the missiles in Cuba as nuclear weapons. Subsequently, Penkovsky was arrested and executed for treason. On October 16th at 8:45 a.m., the CIA report reached President Kennedy's desk, prompting him to convene an emergency meeting of the National Security Executive Committee. The situation was urgent, as the Soviets were so close to the U.S. The committee devised 3 potential responses. The first involved targeted bombing of Soviet military bases in Cuba to eliminate the nuclear weapons. The second proposed a direct invasion of Cuba. And the third suggested establishing a naval blockade to prevent ships and supplies from reaching the island. Kennedy deserves recognition for his response during this critical time. The military was exerting significant pressure on him. Military leaders, inherently inclined towards conflict, were advocating for war. Both General Taylor and General LeMay, the head of the U.S. Air Force, openly pushed for an invasion. However, Kennedy held firm against their demands. Despite this resistance, troop deployments to Florida commenced, but a final decision regarding Cuba had yet to be reached. On October 18th, 2 days later, Kennedy held a meeting with Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin and Foreign Minister Gromyko. They claimed that missiles in Cuba were not addressed during this conversation. While Kennedy inquired about the Cold War and the situation in West Berlin, the topic of missiles was avoided. Concurrently, Kennedy's brother, Robert, met with Bolshakov, a GRU officer, during which the issue of missiles was broached indirectly. Kennedy stated to Bolshakov, "We know, we have all the information. You have placed missiles in Cuba." Bolshakov responded, "Honestly, I'm not aware of that." It is evident that only a select few diplomats, perhaps just a handful of intelligence agents, truly understood the situation in Cuba. Operation Anadyr was conducted with the highest level of secrecy. Thus, Kennedy faced a critical decision and ultimately opted for the naval blockade, which involved American ships patrolling Cuba's coastline to restrict any vessels from nearing the island. An intriguing point arises. The U.S. missile deployment in Turkey was not deemed an act of aggression. Therefore, the Soviet Union's installation of missiles in Cuba should not have been viewed as such either. However, under UN convention, a naval blockade is classified as an act of aggression, requiring Kennedy to seek authorization from the UN Security Council. Unfortunately, the UN, both then and now, was often slow and indecisive, meaning any decisions would likely face delays. What action did Kennedy take? He sought the support of the Organization of American States, OAS, which had ratified the Rio Pact, a mutual defense agreement against external threats. The OAS endorsed the naval blockade of Cuba, stating it was intended to safeguard the security of its member countries. This situation is akin to the Soviet Union seeking approval from Warsaw Pact nations before invading Austria, instead of going through the UN Security Council, an approval they would likely have granted. Beginning on October 20th, U.S. forces were placed on high alert, with all American troops at the highest level of readiness. It's important to emphasize that the global community remained unaware of these developments. At that time, platforms like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Telegram did not exist. There were no social networks or leaks. If a similar situation occurred today, a soldier could post a selfie from a military site. Someone might tweet about troop movements, and rumors would circulate rapidly online, sparking widespread panic. The media would readily amplify the situation. In contrast, back then, communication was limited to newspapers and television, leaving the public in the dark about what was happening. On October 22nd, Kennedy spoke to the nation and the world, revealing that the Soviet Union had positioned missiles in Cuba. He characterized this as a violation of U.S. national security and announced a naval blockade around Cuba, covering a perimeter of 956 kilometers where no ships could approach the island. In response, Khrushchev issued a protest, asserting that the Soviet Union would not adhere to the blockade, labeling it an act of aggression. He declared that Soviet ships would continue to operate between Cuba and other ports, with no intention of complying with the blockade. I find myself questioning why Khrushchev didn't promptly turn to the UN Security Council to state that the Soviet actions were a direct reaction to the U.S. deploying missiles in Turkey. It remains puzzling. Regardless, events progressed with the Soviet Union becoming increasingly isolated. With media tightly controlled, Soviet citizens were kept uninformed, while both Europe and America were gripped by fear. This is when the Russians are coming panic began. American school children were taught how to use gas masks, and many constructed bomb shelters. Scenarios often depicted in cartoons emerged during this period. Regarding the global response, the Soviet Union had few allies beyond its satellite nations and Warsaw Pact countries. Western Europe overwhelmingly backed the United States, as did most of Latin America and Turkey. The only significant support for Cuba came from China, but at that time, China was not the influential nation it is today. While it had a large population and army, its military and economy were relatively weak, making its backing of Cuba less impactful on the global stage. On October 24th, the blockade commenced, with 180 U.S. Navy ships encircling Cuba. Simultaneously, a Soviet convoy consisting of 30 ships and 4 submarines was en route to Cuba, including the Alexandrov, which was transporting an additional 24 nuclear warheads. Upon learning of the blockade, Khrushchev instructed the ships to reverse course. However, 4 vessels, including the Alexandrov and the submarines, continued on. All Warsaw Pact nations placed their armed forces on high alert. At this critical juncture, the world edged closer than ever to a catastrophic confrontation. Panic ensued, fueled by media coverage and the profound fear of a potential nuclear war. That night, Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin met with Kennedy to discuss the escalating situation, but they failed to reach a consensus. Kennedy reported that Dobrynin continued to deny the presence of missiles in Cuba. The two leaders exchanged telegrams regarding the naval blockade, with Kennedy warning, "You must not provoke us. We will sink your ships if they approach Cuba." In response, Khrushchev stated, "If you try to stop our ships, they will be accompanied by warships and submarines, and we will retaliate by sinking yours." This correspondence marked a critical moment, a final warning, indicating that war could erupt at any moment. On October 25th, the UN finally took action by convening an emergency session of the Security Council. The American representative Stevenson directly confronted the Soviet representative Zorin, asking, "Mr. Zorin, what can you tell us about Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba?" Zorin remained silent, buying time. Frustrated, Stevenson shouted at him, "Mr. Zorin, do you speak English? Stop stalling and just answer yes or no. Are your missiles in Cuba or not?" Zorin responded, "In due time, mister." "Stevenson, you will receive a response to that question from our government." At that moment, American representatives presented enlarged aerial photographs to the world, clearly showing the Soviet missiles in Cuba. The global media overwhelmingly favored the Americans, resulting in a decisive loss for the Soviet information campaign. However, The situation was quite different in the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact countries, where state-controlled media produced a calm atmosphere. The public remained largely unaware of the true events unfolding. Had the Soviets publicized the situation, it likely would have caused panic in the U.S. Meanwhile, the Americans escalated their armed forces to DEFCON 2. This status indicates a significant threat level, and at that time in American history, it represented the highest tension ever experienced. Khrushchev sought to negotiate, and on October 26th, a meeting of the Defense Council took place. Following the discussions, he reportedly suggested, "Comrades, let's attend the Bolshoi Theater to show the people that the government stands with them and that there is no threat to the Soviet citizens." Meanwhile, articles had begun to circulate accusing the Americans of aggression towards the Island of Freedom, or Cuba. As a result, Soviet citizens began protesting outside the American embassy, waving signs that read "No to War" and "Peace to the World" right at the embassy gates. Khrushchev initiated a diplomatic maneuver by telegraphing Kennedy to propose a potential agreement. The Soviet demands were straightforward. The U.S. would need to remove its missiles from Turkey, lift the blockade on Cuba, and assure that it would not attempt to overthrow the Cuban government again. In exchange, the Soviets would withdraw their weapons from Cuba. This telegram was dispatched. Simultaneously, an intriguing back channel developed involving an influential American journalist, John Scali of ABC, who had ties to the Kennedy family and Texas financiers. He met with his Soviet counterpart, Alexander Feklisov, whose exact role, either at the embassy or in trade, was somewhat unclear. However, anyone in such close contact with Americans was typically a KGB agent. Indeed, Feklisov was a KGB resident. During their meeting, Scali asked, "Alex, do you think this could escalate into nuclear war? Are you serious? We're taking this very seriously." Feklisov responded, "We're serious as well. I may only be involved in trade, but I've heard rumors. Khrushchev is indicating that a deal is possible." Later that evening, Scali spoke with Robert Kennedy, relaying a message that his Russian contacts indicated that a negotiation was still possible. However, anxiety continued to escalate. On both sides, military leaders felt there was no value in further discussions. They believed it was time to act, convinced that victory could be achieved. American and Soviet generals were pushing for decisive action. October 27th marked the most harrowing day of the crisis. At 10 a.m., Soviet anti-aircraft crews in Cuba, acting without orders from their commander, shot down a U-2 reconnaissance aircraft, resulting in the death of its pilot, Rudolf Anderson. 2 additional planes flying over Cuba also came under fire. Meanwhile, another U-2, piloted by Chuck Maltzby, traversed Soviet airspace for 1 hour and 22 minutes. Although MiG fighters were unable to intercept him, he safely returned to the U.S. In response, the Soviets issued a protest note, while the Americans claimed that unusual atmospheric conditions had caused the plane to inadvertently enter Soviet airspace. While they attributed the incident to unreliable instruments, it was evident that the plane was engaged in reconnaissance activities. Amid the escalating crisis, Fidel Castro emerged as another key figure. He urgently went to the Soviet embassy, demanding a nuclear strike on Florida, fueled by his belief based on his intelligence sources that the Americans would invade the following day. In a state of panic, Castro insisted that the Soviet Union initiate the conflict right away. A compelling orator, he proclaimed, "I and all the Cuban people are prepared to sacrifice ourselves to punish the American aggressors once and for all," conveying a message of unwavering resolve. The climax of the crisis felt miraculous, almost as though it were touched by divine intervention. While I'm not particularly religious, I find it difficult to explain the events otherwise. The U.S. Navy identified two Soviet submarines, B-130 and B-59, stationed off the coast of Cuba. American forces began dropping depth charges and signaling grenades, urging the submarines to surface at once. During this tense moment, the crews held a meeting where most officers advocated for a torpedo strike. On the B-59, there were nuclear warhead-equipped torpedoes, and the officers decided they had to launch an immediate attack to sink the American ships. However, one senior officer, Vasily Arkhipov, cast a dissenting vote. Later interviewed by Americans, he was dubbed the man who saved the world. This highlights the stakes. If an American warship had been attacked and sunk, it would have prompted retaliation by destroying our submarines. With Castro in a state of panic and tensions rising, a Soviet strike on Florida could have escalated the situation dramatically, leading to unpredictable consequences. Thankfully, restraint prevailed, and ultimately, a resolution was achieved. That period was undoubtedly the most harrowing of the crisis. Vasily Arkhipov, a senior Soviet naval officer, played a crucial role in averting disaster by refusing to authorize an attack. Following this pivotal moment, diplomacy took center stage. Robert Kennedy met again with Dobrynin, and Khrushchev and Kennedy began exchanging telegrams, initiating a series of negotiations. While the Soviet demands remained consistent, the American stance was initially less defined. However, by November 20th, a consensus was established. The agreement stipulated that the U.S. would refrain from attempts to overthrow the Cuban government and withdraw its missiles from Turkey, while the Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba. Additionally, the Americans lifted their naval blockade. Approximately a month later, the Soviets, under American and international oversight, dismantled and removed their missiles from Cuba. On November 20th, the U.S. lifted the naval blockade, effectively marking the conclusion of the Cuban Missile Crisis. By early 1963, American missiles were also withdrawn from Turkey, bringing both sides back to their original positions, thus resolving the crisis. What were the key outcomes of the crisis? The most significant result was the successful agreement between Kennedy and Khrushchev, which prevented a nuclear war, highlighting the triumph of diplomacy. Additionally, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Cold War tensions began to relax, with no further instances of such severe confrontation between the U.S. and the USSR until the Soviet Union's collapse. Even events like the conflict in Afghanistan did not escalate to that level. Moreover, the United States honored its commitment and has refrained from attempting to overthrow Fidel Castro's regime to this day. Diplomats from both the U.S. and the Soviet Union perceived their outcomes as victories, each side believing they had accomplished their objectives. In contrast, military leaders in both nations felt a sense of defeat, with both Soviet and American generals viewing it as a significant embarrassment. For Kennedy, This situation was initially regarded as a low point in American diplomacy, feeling he had succumbed to the Soviets. Historians often argue that the crisis marked the beginning of Khrushchev's downfall. His unilateral approach to resolving the issue without consulting others ultimately contributed to his removal through a conspiracy. Nevertheless, in that crucial moment, diplomacy triumphed over military might. This prompted the establishment of a direct communication line between Washington and Moscow, as reliance on telegrams and radio communications had proven inadequate. Since then, presidents from both sides have been able to communicate and negotiate directly at any time. While it is an ongoing process that takes time, the direct line remains in place. I would like to conclude this episode with a heartfelt letter from Nikita Khrushchev, which I find deeply human. In his message to John F. Kennedy on November 1st, 1962, Khrushchev wrote, "Together, we have likely transcended our own pride for our mutual benefit. Some critics may nitpick over our agreement and argue about who made bigger concessions. However, I believe we both chose reason and reached a rational solution that secured peace for everyone, including those who may later seek to find faults in it." That concludes the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I appreciate you watching this blog and all your comments. Many of you have reached out during this challenging time, expressing that this content provides a welcome distraction from current events. Please take care of yourselves. God bless you all.